Hi, this is Darren at SimNation. Just wanted to do a quick regular season ending recap for SNCFL, which is one of our two draft day sports college football 2024 leagues here at SimNation. GMCFL is the other one, and of course, GMCFL is more focused on you're the athletic director versus SNCFL is you can be the athletic director or coaches and other things. Um, so the regular season's over. Really interesting dynamic going into the playoffs. Couple kind of shocks about who made it into the playoffs and who didn't. And some heartbreakers in the end, like Iowa State and Florida State. So that's Shark and just Sample, just getting edged out in the end and not making it in. And then some of the shocks are like seeing UNLV and TCU make it in. That's definitely a shock. So let's just dive straight into the conference championships because those just happened. I will say kudos to Stewart. He has two undefeated teams. And there would have been Skeletor, but Skeletor, of course, lost to Georgia, which is Shark in the conference championship. And then, of course, Maryland was also undefeated. So if we dive right in, and I've already looked at some of these because I tried to do this video and I messed up something. Gary is at Miami. He easily took care of Boston College and knocked Boston College out of the playoff conversation. Really good game from Guerrero, who is his main running back. Definitely helped him win. Uh, Frankie, for the second time this season, took out Shark. This game was full of interceptions. I think there was like 5 in total. Crutchell threw 2, and then of course, if we look, Gooding definitely cost Shark the game with his 3 interceptions and just generally a really bad passing performance from them. But second time Frankie's taken them out. The first time actually was Skelter who was running Frankie's team for him because Frankie was away. But Oklahoma State definitely enters the playoffs in pretty good position. And unfortunately, the loss plus some of the other things that happened knocked Iowa State out of the playoffs. Next up is Maryland versus Iowa. Uh, this one was a interesting game. Iowa under Frankie's gotten better every single season. The last 2 matchups I think have been more blowouts for Maryland. So this one was more of a shootout. So 96 points between the two teams. I think one team threw for 400 yards, the other team ran for 400 yards. So you see Iowa, in all told, they had over 1,000 yards in total offense. And really the differentiator here was Maryland just poured away in the end. Baker had a really good game as he's adopted that new offense at Maryland, which focuses more on the long passing attack than the short. But Frankie definitely ran the ball, which is what you expected Iowa to do. No shame in it. He finishes number 7 and is in the playoffs. Maryland, of course, inhabits the number 1 seed. This is Brian versus, so Brian's at Kent State. Western Michigan is Stewart. We already gave it away that Western Michigan wins this one because they're undefeated. As you can see, it's just one of those games where Western Michigan pretty much dominated. Western Michigan is probably the most dominant team in the MAC, and I'm still considering moving them out of the MAC into something like the American Athletic or something like that or Conference USA so they can face a little bit more of a challenge. But I may not because now you have Skeletor in there with Buffalo, you have Brian in there with Kent State, you have me in there with Central Michigan. So there's a lot of teams that are going to suddenly start competing with Stewart. The shock here was Washington last week beat Washington State and knocked them out of the playoff, out of the championship game. So in some regard, this was kind of a gimme for Stewart. And it shows they just utterly crushed Washington. Made mincemeat of Kim Hawthorne, who is the really good quarterback at Washington. O'Malley just essentially told him, I'm the better of the 2 quarterbacks, so just go away. Of course, this gives them the number 2 seed um, and doesn't really hurt Washington State's chances of making the playoffs. So Georgia, this is a battle of like the one loss versus the undefeated. So Shark versus Skeletor. And of course, Shark wins this one in the end, despite really Louisiana Monroe having a slightly better game. Compton with his four touchdowns. You can see Jewett kind of cost Louisiana Monroe the game, and of course they scored late to kind of make it close, but weren't able to get close enough to win the game. And if we look at the play-by-play, what we see is that unfortunately Jewett's interception was probably at the worst possible time. They were driving in Georgia territory where a field goal would actually potentially help them win the ball. And unfortunately, they just weren't able to get it done. So they scored, got the stop on Georgia, and then Jewett just kind of cost them the game with that interception. So still great season. Both teams going to the playoffs. Both team top 5 seeds. So that should make life pretty interesting. Coastal Carolina. This is Shark versus the CPU. Unfortunately, CPU didn't give it to Shark and essentially ran past them. But great game from Stapleton, who threw for 451 yards. And overall, it was just a good beginning season for Shark at Coastal Carolina. These are two CPU teams in Houston, South Florida. As you can see, Houston won. Now, Houston's traditionally been a powerhouse in the American Athletic. They used to have a coach named Travis who was really, really good, and he set them up for long-term success before he left. Mountain West, these are two teams that no human is running. So Nevada's just had a really good season. A lot of that has to do with Belcher. As you can see, he threw for over 400 yards, and that definitely helped them win the championship. Same thing here. Marshall and UTEP are both CPU teams, and it kind of a little bit of an upset in the fact that Marshall lost. I expected them to win, but UTEP got a really good game out of Carter and Torres, which led them to the win. So what does that mean for the playoffs? Um, so if we look at the playoffs, what that will mean is Maryland will play Michigan State. This is a rematch. They both play in the same division and within the Big Ten. Maryland pretty decisively beat Michigan State the last time they played. Stewart and UCLA will play Houston. This one's going to be decidedly Houston. I'm sorry, decidedly UCLA. Stewart's just going to probably ground them into the ground. This next game is actually a really good game. So Michigan snuck into the playoffs after having a pretty not so good season. Uh, by their standards and by Stewart's standards, but overall, as you can see, is they came on strong near the end with the wins, but they had 3 losses. To Michigan State, to Iowa, which Frankie was losing in. So you got to bear in mind that they really lost the top 2 of the Big Ten, and when you look at it, they beat a playoff team and then they lost to 3 playoff teams. So it's overall, I mean, that's a pretty good season, and that gives them some uh, chance of beating Georgia with Shark. Now, it's going to be hard. Georgia's very, very good, as you saw against Louisiana Monroe. And really, outside of the Missouri game, Shark has had them dialed in almost the whole season. Now, one could make an argument that they really haven't played anybody tough until Louisiana Monroe. It doesn't really matter. Georgia has a lot of offensive weapons, so it'll be interesting to see how this one pans out. It should be a good game regardless. Western Michigan will take on UNLV. I don't expect this one to be a good game. I expect Western Michigan just to run them over. And then, of course, you have Louisiana Monroe versus TCU. TCU, of course, got demoted at the end of last season, so Colorado could move into the Big 12. They're playing with a chip on their shoulder, but I expect Skeletor to kind of just run past them. And then this is a game that's interesting because these are two friends. This is Gary and Frankie. So this is normally a game you would see in the finals or in the semifinals. To see it in the first round means that a really good team is going to be exiting. I like Oklahoma State in this one. I think that Gary has some young players he's got to work through, and I just think Frankie's better positioned for this one. Um, Iowa versus Washington State. So this is like Frankie and I's second teams against each other. I like Iowa in this. Washington State's coming up back-to-back losses, and they're kind of struggling a little bit right now after they had started the first half of the year undefeated. Oklahoma State, uh, they had a shock loss, but I mean, outside of that loss, they have really done a good job, and the shock loss was to Oklahoma. But as you can see, they've had a really strong year so far, and I kind of expect them to be able to handle Washington State pretty easily. So it'll be an early exit for the Cougars. And then, of course, Nevada versus Rutgers. These are two shock teams, but Rutgers is Kevin. I fully expect Kevin to win this one. And what that will set up for is an interesting run in the playoffs itself. So I don't think I can look at this yet, if I remember correctly. Yeah, well, it'll let me. Um, but what will I think? Well, I'm gonna hold off. I'll do that later. But bowl wise, is we have some interesting matchups, right? So we have Joe Durham versus Washington. Wisconsin's had a really good season, as well as you can see here is uh, they finished 34th. They were 7-5. They actually started the season fairly decently. Before they just ran into the buzzsaw that is, unfortunately, Iowa. And Iowa is just having a remarkable season. So you can see they started 2-1, lost the game to Nebraska, but then bounced back with two straight wins. Ran into Frankie and his buzzsaw, then ran into DP at Ohio State. FAU is not an easy win either. So it's not a bad season. Probably not the season that he wanted to have, but the fact that he's in the Rose Bowl is pretty good. Alabama versus Iowa State. This should be a really good matchup in the Sugar Bowl. So this is DP versus Shark. These two know each other extremely well because they play in the AFC East, where one has the Jets, the other one has the Patriots. So this really should be a great matchup. I expect a pretty high score out of this with very little defense. Colorado in the Cotton Bowl versus Florida State. So this is just sample versus my zero to hero team. Um, yeah, Florida State's probably going to curb stomp Colorado. This is a horrible matchup for Colorado, mostly because Florida State has arguably one of the better quarterbacks and a really good run game. Coastal Carolina, this is Shark versus Toledo. Fully expect Shark to win this one, candidly. I don't see a path where Toledo would actually beat them. James Madison versus Troy. So this is SOA versus Troy. I expect Troy to win this one. No offense to SOA in the New Orleans Bowl, but I think Troy's the better team. Central Michigan versus UTEP. This is one of my teams versus the CPU. Uh, I'm going to go with UTEP. Central Michigan is a hot and cold team, and also UTEP has a fairly good offense that I don't know that they're going to run well against them. So we'll see how that pans out, but I don't think Central Michigan can hold up to UTEP, unfortunately. Fresno State versus San Diego State. So if I remember correctly, this is going to be, I think one of these teams is Starfinder. I think Fresno State is Starfinder, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So I expect Fresno State to win this one. Starfinders had a pretty good season. Stanford versus Virginia Tech. This is going to be a really good one. So this is Skelter versus Bama in the Boca Raton Bowl. So um, I think Virginia Tech wins this one. Skelter will be mad at me, but I think Bama should have had a better season than he did. And at one point, he was contending for the ACC Coastal. Stanford, I don't feel like was really ever contending. Uh, But also, in fairness to Skelton, he's rebuilding Stanford, and he's done a pretty good job there. So I like Virginia Tech in this one. This one is Cable versus Utah State, so Central Florida. Cable's done a good job of bouncing back here. He's had some struggles with Central Florida, but I feel like Central Florida is now on the upward swing, and I think he wins this one pretty easily. Kansas versus Notre Dame. This is Van versus Notre Dame. I like the Jayhawks in this one. I think they'll win it pretty sizably. Um, just because I think Notre Dame is generally speaking very hyped. And as a result of that, I think that it shouldn't be too hard. Brian didn't have a great season at USC, not on the level I think he wanted. He gets my old team at Texas Tech, who's a CPU. But I think USC's on a good trajectory now. They did upset Washington State. Didn't just upset Washington State. They beat Washington State down, who at the time I think was a top 5 team. So I like USC in this one, even though the CPU thinks Texas Tech is going to win. I don't agree with that. This one, if I remember correctly, is going to be between two CPU teams, so I'm not going to talk about it. Tom's moved on from Auburn temporarily, so he's not there. This is Van versus Wake Forest. I like Oregon State in this game in the Holiday Bowl. I think Van's done a pretty good job with Oregon State. We mentioned this one earlier that this is Bryan versus Louisiana Lafayette. I think Kent State wins this one pretty easily. This is Skelter versus Boise State, which is ironic. It's his old team that he used to have. I like Buffalo in this one. I think Buffalo was having a good season, but the wheels kind of came off with Buffalo near the end. I forget how many games I think that they've lost at this point. Just look at that real quick. So yeah, Buffalo at one point looked like they were going to be in position to kind of be that player in the MAC East. Because at that point, I think that they were, if I remember correctly, they're like 7-1. Then they ran into Ball State, lost to Ball State, lost to Central Michigan, lost to Bowling Green, and then bounced back against the Ducks. But that kind of kicked them out of any playoff contention. And of course, they did beat Bryan, who was at Kent State. So I do like Buffalo. I think he's got them back on the right path. This is Soa versus Starfinder, if I remember correctly. And this one's a tough one. Florida has underachieved, which most seasons Starfinder doesn't. I'm sorry, SOA doesn't underachieve, but they were 7-5. They're on a 2-game winning streak, and if I remember correctly, that includes beating Florida State, who was a top 25 team. Actually, was higher than a top 25 team. And then of course Minnesota is 6-6. I think Florida wins this one. It's not a great matchup for. It's definitely not a great matchup for Starfinder in this one. So Cincinnati, if I remember correctly, this is DWK. Will he kind of got them back on path? Cincinnati finished the year 7-5. I think they were on a 3-game winning streak, so I'd like Cincinnati in this one to win this one pretty easily. This is Stewart, if I remember correctly. This is his project team. He's done a great job at Duke. If we look at Duke, um, first of all, just for transparency, I hate Duke. But I'll leave that alone for right now. And the reason why I hate him is because I'm a Maryland fan and all those years of basketball with the ACC. But just as you can see, Duke has had really bad run before really kind of Stewart came along and helped get them in a better place. So I do think that I do think that he's gonna do a pretty good job with them in this one, and I think they win this one pretty easily. As you can see, they're coming off a 3-game winning streak. They've actually won 5 of their last 6, and that includes beating Virginia Tech pretty sizably, by the way, and then also a win against NC State. So yeah, I kind of like this one. I do think that Duke will win it. And getting back in here, so that's against Memphis. Trying to remember. Pittsburgh is one of our newer coaches, who just joined the league. And actually, I got to remember to go talk to someone about Syracuse. So this is Brandon. Brandon's brand new to the league, so he gets my old team in Southern Miss. This was one of my 0 to hero teams. Pittsburgh should win this one relatively easily. Up next is a battle of two human coaches. Georgia Southern, if I remember correctly, is DWK. Clemson is Spoof. Clemson definitely didn't have the season that I think that Spoof wanted. We'll just take a look there real quick. So they were 6-6. Not with the talent that Clemson has, they should have had a better season. But as you can see, it's kind of streaky, right? 1-2, lost 3, 1-3, lost 3. They did beat South Carolina, which in most years would be enough to keep them. They did beat DP at Syracuse. They beat NC State. They lost to Gary. They lost to the eventual Atlantic winner. They did beat DP with Alabama, so maybe next year what they need to do is really focus on just playing DP. But Spoof will get him turned around. He's a really good coach. He's already proving that in the WWPF. And then, of course, we look at Georgia Southern, which is DWK. It pretty much up and down for them. They did beat James Madison. Um, they did beat Troy, the one of the few teams that did. So when you think about it, is this one should go to Clemson, but I think it's going to be a close one. Mostly just because one, DWK is a good coach, but two, Clemson's kind of underachieved most of the year. California, if I remember correctly, I think California is Bama. I could be wrong on that. I'm gonna double check that. Yeah, it's Bama's second team. So Steve has left Oklahoma temporarily. So if Steve was there, I would say probably Steve, but I like Bama's chances in this one. BYU versus Virginia. This will be Starfinder at BYU. Um, I kind of expect him to win this one fairly easily. Ohio State, this is DP. He's in a curb stomp Arkansas. This isn't even close to a matchup, and I don't even know why the CPU thinks that that's going to be that close. Arizona State versus Vanderbilt. I'm going to break off here in a moment when we don't have any more. None of the rest of the games are human, so I really don't kill. But as you can see, there's quite a bit of humans in the bowl season. Um, I think from a league leader's perspective, it's going to get interesting really quick to see who's going to win the Heisman. I really like Jackie Bush to win it. He's had a great season. He definitely has led Troy, but you could throw Jerome Belcher in there as well. He's also had a really good season. Passing rating, take that off because that's all right. Again, you can just see that all around Bush has had a great season. Nobody broke the 2,000 yard mark. That's the first time in a few seasons. Uh, but Edward Yang won it from Oklahoma State for the regular season with Zachary Grady a close second. And then you can see LaFleur, who's a senior. I think he graduates this year. And then Anthony Church and Reginald Ashby. Ashby's also a senior. So rushing touchdown wise, this is no shock. Bustos started the season really fast. Hollow's also a scoring machine. Both those teams have good, solid running attacks. It makes complete sense that Barton is the number one, but as you can see, DP with Kish and then just Sample with Tony Hamilton, they were both right up there when it came to the best wide receivers from a yardage perspective. And of course, Tony Hamilton caught a ton of touchdown passes. Lindbergh came on near the end of the season as Mellon switched it up and started to throw the ball long more. No shock here. Colo is one of the best defensive ends in the league. Great season for Stewart. And then interception wise is again, Gunter was someone that I'm pretty high on, and he just had a great season. So it makes complete sense that he's there. So, what's up next is the bowls and then the playoffs. I'll probably do another video right as we get past the first round. I may do the first round live. I haven't decided. But it should be an interesting playoffs this season. There are quite a few really good teams in it. Initial thought about what could happen is, of course, Maryland is one that everybody's going to keep an eye on because Maryland's a juggernaut. But keep an eye on UCLA and Georgia. Every season, Georgia's gotten stronger and stronger. Sharks been knocking on that door for quite a bit now. Stewart has yet to make a deep run into the playoffs with UCLA, but I expect him to this season. Western Michigan, we'll see. I think Western Michigan does very well during the regular season, but when we get into the playoffs, they almost always run into one of the top teams who knock them out in the second round. Skelter's run before with Louisiana Monroe. It's quite possible he does it again this time. He's got a good team. Keep an eye on Oklahoma State and Iowa. More Oklahoma State than Iowa, but Frankie has a really good team there. And outside of that one loss to Oklahoma, he would be undefeated. Rutgers is another team to keep an eye on. Kevin has done a really good job with Rutgers this season. Now, I know he's probably still steaming about what Maryland did to them, but that doesn't really say anything. There's a huge talent differential between those two teams, and he's just done a phenomenal job at Rutgers throughout the season. Keep an eye on Gary because if there's anybody who's going to make a deep run into the playoffs that's kind of you're not thinking about, it's going to be Miami. The best CPU team to keep an eye on in my view is Michigan State. The problem with Michigan State is they run into Maryland. And Maryland's probably going to knock them out. So it would probably be Nevada would be the next one to keep an eye on. So that's it for now. Hopefully you find this video to your liking. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks. Bye.